Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another Salam cast. And I'm here joined with Abdullah Andalusia. How are you?
Alhamdulillah. How you doing, brother?
Alhamdulillah. For those who don't know, Abdullah Andalusia is a prominent Muslim debater who's had, dozens of debates on a range of different topics, many on comparative religion and political philosophy. And today, inshallah, we're going to be talking about liberalism, which is a very big topic and a very important one, especially because we live in a liberal world. And something Muslims don't maybe potentially talk as much about as they need to. So I'll jump straight into it, inshallah, and ask you a few questions about this. It's an area of research for me as well. I mean, I'm quite interested in this. We'll be taking my notes, and it's always a pleasure having you here to share notes with you. For those who don't know, before any important debate of mine, I try and bring Abdullah Andalusi and speak with him, share notes with him. He was one of the main people that came before the David Wood debate. In fact, shared a lot of his notes with me. He's not selfish with that information, and hopefully, inshallah, he won't be selfish today as well. Tell us all we need to know. All right, so let's start with a very, very basic question. Obviously, someone might think, I'm not sure what we're talking about here. So, what is liberalism?
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Firstly, barakallah feek for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on here. And yeah, liberalism, I think, is a topic that's not so much discussed, and I think it's good that like Islam is bringing this up to kind of introduce Muslims to it.
Yes.
Because when Muslims usually hear the word liberalism, it sounds like some really abstract political, like academic term, and they don't really understand what it is. But yet, it affects most of their lives. It affects the Muslim world. Colonialism is the after effect of liberalism in the Muslim world, and it even penetrates aspects of our theology. It gives its kind of repercussions, inspires doubts in Muslims about Islam, about religion in general, about God, and it all kind of emanates from the idea of liberalism.
A lot of questions that we get in terms of propagation of Islam, for example, like questions especially related to the hudud, the punitive laws of Islam, are based on some kind of liberal presuppositionalism.
Yes, every problem that the West or even certain secular Muslim regimes and others have with Islamic law, with Islam as a comprehensive Sharia, both as a personal code as well as a politically applied law, is all due to the criteria on values of liberalism. So it's where liberalism clashes with Islamic precepts and ideas. That's where Islam is always kind of put on the back foot and challenged, and Muslims are forced to kind of, or asked certain questions. Do you support this? Do you support that? Which is in contradiction to liberalism. So, I suppose this is very needed discussion, and it really, Muslims need to be able to kind of have confidence in their deen, as well as know the DNA of liberalism, where it came from, how it's justified, and more importantly, its inherent problems in order to challenge it. So, in terms of like what is liberalism,
right?
So the term, people always think liberalism comes from the term like liberty or just being free, but really actually comes from the term liberality, which means to be generous, as in as a ruler is generous to his people, gives them as much space to do what they want, and hence it's called being generous to people, at least in giving them space and not imposing too many restrictions. So that's kind of where it generally came from. But in essence, its core meaning is that every human individual is supreme sovereign, the supreme absolute lord of themselves and their property. Society doesn't have rights. Religion doesn't have rights. God doesn't have rights. The supreme sovereign over a human being, according to liberalism, is the individual themselves.
Would you say they don't have rights, or would you say that the primacy of primacy is given to the individual over and above, for example, community or social, familial units?
Well, in origin, any rights, what we call social rights, society rights, is more rights of the state, and is only justified if the individuals all get together, make a contract, an aqd, a covenant,
a social contract.
Yeah, to have a state that will protect them from each other. And then only once they make this kind of contract to create a state, does the state have any rights. But it only has rights if individuals give it the rights. But fundamentally, individuals have the supreme rights. And that's
what's it for yourself?
Barakallahu feek. So that's kind of how liberalism is kind of viewed. And because all individuals are equally individuals, whatever that term means, therefore the idea of equality. So everyone has the same rights and has, in an ideal kind of liberal worldview, people should have as much rights as possible, limited by the exact same rights of their fellow individuals. And there's nothing more important or more fundamental than individuals. And that's kind of the viewpoint of liberalism, has defined.
Okay, so liberalism is, how would you answer that in one sentence?
What liberalism is?
Yeah, someone's, okay, now you've spoken for a long time now.
yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground. Put it in 2 sentences. What is liberalism?
Well, to paraphrase a Greek kind of philosopher, liberalism is the individuals are the supreme lords over themselves and their property.
Okay. Now, let's get to some of the historical context of this, because it didn't obviously arrive in a historical vacuum. It came about as a result of a very important historical context. So let's talk about where did it come from? Where did liberalism come from? How did it emerge?
Okay. Well, I mean, before I go into that, I suppose I wanted to kind of link it to modern day manifestations that they see, right? So when you turn on the TV, you see these adverts like, live free, buy this product gives you freedom, this product gives you power, and power is defined as the ability to do things. So this, or empowerment is viewed as a very kind of positive idea and so on.
On power, though, I mean, what power is defined as is a massive topic in and of itself, isn't it? I mean, I remember going through a module, university on this, and Foucauldian understanding of power versus, Robert Dahl's understanding of power, Barrett's understanding of, but all these different names, everyone has very specific, and this is the reason why I'm bringing this up is because it comes about all the time. When we talk about liberalism and politics and kind of like social relations, we also talk about power dynamics. It's a term that's continually brought up. But the term itself has no unanimous agreement as to its definition from a terminological perspective. So I guess what I'm asking is, I guess we can caveat this here because before we continue, the discussion on power, how does it link with liberalism?
Well, liberalism, at least in its aqidah, its creed, believes that any individual should not have power over another individual like a master to slave kind of relationship, right? So you can't control other people by physical coercion, right? They make an exception for the state, which we'll come back to, right? But anyway, so in theory, when they mean by power, they mean to expand your sphere of freedom, that you can do more things. Right, and you have the ability to do more things. So we can make your voice louder by social media. So social media empowers you. You should vote because this will determine public policy. So you should have the freedom to vote. This empowers you. And of course, buying products, clothes, computers, buying music, buying a whole number of different things. These are all meant to be manifestation. But they're usually those who kind of are into marketing will try to market using the Aqidah of liberalism, saying that this is you deciding to be yourself, be unique, buy these clothes, even though they're mass produced in the same kind of shape and the same colors, bought by thousands. But you be unique, you be yourself. And to do that, you have to buy our product. Because this will give you the power to be yourself, to be an individual, to be different. And of course, being different from the crowd, as they say, you must be different, be unique and individual, because they say, well, the individual is supreme, and following society is kind of being a slave to other people. So you should be individual and unique. But in practice, what happens is that the media moguls, the fashion moguls, all the people that control mass market consumer products can dictate how people act, and most people will kind of follow the same kind of template. They'll conform, essence. They'll wear the same kind of fashions. They'll do this. They'll like the same kind of things. They'll adopt the same kind of customs, because humans are great conformists by nature. But it's marketed as, but this is from the akida of you being different, you being unique, you being you, especially you. But what is you? And I'm probably getting ahead of myself from later discussions, but like, what is you? And of course, what is an individual? And the way they describe it, it's like, you know how we have our Tawheed, right? The Tawheed, we believe in Ahad, right? Allah is independent. He's unique, nothing like unto him. But in individualism, or which is the akida of liberalism, liberalism being the political system of individualism, the individual is made like God. The individual is independent, is unique, is self-sufficient, self-reliant. That's why people say, I don't want to depend on other people. I want to be self-reliant, right? I don't want to depend on men. I don't want to depend on women. I don't want to depend on parents. I don't want to depend on friends or family or others. I want to be self-sufficient. That's how I want to manifest my individuality. Even though humans, I mean, look, if the farmers stop making food, whatever, they all starve. Mm-hmm. If people stop making their computers, they like to tap about and tweet about their individuality, they wouldn't have computers. They depend on other people making stuff for them, and in a lot of cases giving it to them, including free health systems in certain countries that do free health systems. Anyway, So I digress. So all this comes from liberalism and individualism, and so to go back to that question you asked, which is where did it come from? And how did it justified? Well, people think that there's a lot of misconceptions about liberalism, a lot of misconceptions about where it comes from amongst even like non-Muslims as well, not just Muslims. But basically, it came from a particular historical quirk of Western Europe. So we know that obviously it goes. If you want to go back to St. Paul. This guy or Saul of Tarsus, he didn't meet Jesus, never met Jesus at all. He wanted to market Christianity to non-Jews, but the Greeks and the Romans, and they didn't want to kind of adopt circumcision, restrict what food they ate, and follow the Jewish laws. And so he said, okay, you know what? It's okay as long as you have faith. You don't have to follow these laws. In fact, these laws are abolished, or not abolished, but they are. They've been superseded by just having faith in Jesus, who died for your sins. They argue, and that's sufficient. So sola fide, just faith alone. So they got rid of the Jewish laws. Now that's important to know. But
that's an interesting connection. I never thought of it like that, because you're connecting that with liberalism.
Yeah.
Although obviously at this time no one would have called it that. You're saying that this is. It's almost as if you're coming now to a Weberian, like Max Weber. He kind of argued in his one of his works, The Protestant Ethic of Capitalist Society, if I remember correctly.
Protestant work ethic, yeah.
The book which argued that after the Protestant Reformation, that kind of spurred Protestantism. It spurred capitalism. So in a sense, there was a religious connection with. What would then become supply-side economic policy, right? It's understanding of kind of liberal economics. So I understood that one, but now you bring it all back to Paul. You're saying that Paul's kind of abandonment of the Jewish tradition is also indicative of a kind of liberalism, although it wasn't called this.
Like it created the DNA that would later lead to the circumstances that was ripe for, you could say, the rise of liberalism.
Okay.
Because, so in a nutshell, the Roman Empire adopts Christianity.
Right.
It becomes very easy to adopt it. It views it as a good idea, mainly because some people argue because they wanted to keep the empire together and it was already kind of crumbling, so they wanted to keep it together. So it was adopted by the Romans. They then, during the Emperor Theodosius II, his decree, he basically forced people to become Christian, that pagan temples would be destroyed, and everyone should be Christian, including, there's even a few kind of discussions in, like in Egypt, for example, there's a lot of discussions about, Muslims are a foreign religion and they came and they imposed, some people argue, Muslims came to Egypt and they imposed their religion on Egyptians, which is not true. Mm-hmm. What is true is that the Romans enforced Christianity upon the pagan Egyptians and forced them without any choice to become Christian, which is why you have Christians there today. Coptic Christians, or Kipti as they say, right? Anyway, so the Roman Empire forces their populations to become Christian, and then they split between two emperors. Eastern Roman Empire are we call them the Byzantines. They didn't call themselves that, they just called themselves Romans. and obviously we have a history of that with those guys. But Western Rome collapses, and the barbarians come in. All these Germanic guys with blonde hair and blue eyes started, rampaging across Europe. All the institutions that Rome built up started to be destroyed, or usually they kind of fell into disrepair, and no one knew how to repair it. Anyway, long story. So then there was one surviving institution, which was the Roman Catholic Church, or the Church of Rome anyway, or the Bishop of Rome to be more exact. Now, prior to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Bishop of Rome was just one bishop in a council of bishops, the Bishop of Alexandria, the Bishop of Antioch, and controlled by the Eastern Roman Emperor, right, who was the head of, you could say, the head of their church, right, the head of the church. So what happens is that as the Eastern Roman Empire starts to weaken, partly due to Muslims having wars with the Byzantine Romans, the Bishop of Rome becomes independent in Europe, and then he says, well, now I can, what can we do? Well, let's preach Christianity. Some of these German barbarians already adopted Christianity during the Roman times anyway, because Rome was viewed as a civilization, and the religion of civilization from their perspective was Christianity, right? So let's preach, and we are the head of our own church. And then they use some biblical scripture to say that, Peter is the founder of the Church of Rome, and it's alleged that Jesus promised Peter that whatever you promise on earth, I will promise in heaven. So if Peter says that to someone, your sins are forgiven, then God will forgive that person's sins. And of course, the Bishop of Rome said, we are the successors, the Khalifa of Peter. Right. So now we are the head of the church, the Catholic Church. Catholic means universal, right? So they start going to all these different German kingdoms and saying, embrace Christianity. We can do a lot of good for you. You don't know how to read and write. We can teach you that. We can be the administration. We can help in diplomatic communications. We can also help with administration, but we can also help with telling the people that you are legitimate kings and no one should rebel against you. Probably similar to what I've seen in some Muslim world today, but anyway, in some cases. But so we will be the scholars that will come along and tell people to obey you because you are the divinely appointed kings, as long as you accept us as the church. And so most of these Germanic kings said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. And they adopted it, Christianity. Now, I'm a bit fast forwarded because I don't want to turn into a long history lesson. This caused some later problems because Roman Catholic Church was only concerned with just getting converts and, of course, maybe getting a little bit of taxes. But they started to interfere more and more in the affairs of the kings and rulers of Europe. And during the Crusades, for example, the church gained the power to launch wars. And that was kind of like when they reached the ascendancy. So in a way, Europe today is a product of Muslims weakening the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, making the Church of Rome free, and being the target of the Crusades, which made the Roman Catholic Church become supreme, which led to the conditions that happened in Europe. It's a funny anecdote, but it's just a quirk of history. Anyway, so this occurred. Now the church said that their interpretation of Christianity cannot be questioned. Now, they had some ikhtilaf, some difference of opinion amongst their scholars. And of course, famous Thomas Aquinas was called a doctor of the church for his kind of collections of philosophy. So they not every, let's say, Catholic agreed with Thomas Aquinas. So you could have some ikhtilaf. But on core issues of creed, you have to accept what the Catholic Church said. Otherwise, you are a heretic. And then the church could ask the kings and their courts to basically burn you at the stake as a heretic. And they would have to comply. So you had this mixture of church law and you could say secular law, or the law of these kings, these European kings, side by side. But the problem is that Europe started to kind of receive translations of old Greek texts from the Muslims, which we had got from the Byzantines.
Where are we now in terms of what century? Like 14th, 15th, 16th?
We're looking at 1000, 1100 to now. Let's say 1400.
Okay.
So you have this time, which is called the Renaissance or the rebirth of Europe from its dark ages.
They say the Renaissance is Renaissance period is around what is after 1480. Say
They say that, but some historians talk about the 12th century Renaissance.
Okay.
Due to Christian contact with Muslims, or you should say Western European Christian contact with Muslims.
which coincided with the early modern period as well.
Well, the Renaissance wouldn't be called the modern period until the Enlightenment, I think. So they still consider it to be in the medieval period, but I mean, historians have debates all the time about all this.
Do they say that it's kind of like? I mean, I've seen lots of discussions on when the medieval period starts, when the early modern period starts, when the medieval period ends. Is usually when the early modern period, they say, starts. The Renaissance period starts. But this point here, are we talking about, because just to kind of flesh this out a little bit, we're talking about kind of like English kings, Dutch kings, French kings at this time.
Yeah.
Now a lot of them seeing the need to separate from, potentially, or being given an incentive to separate from the Catholic Church.
Well, it was kind of more like, I mean, no king could justify it because prior to the Renaissance, because if they said we don't need the Catholic Church, the Church would say, this king, we excommunicate this king, like a kind of takfir, and no Christian subject of that king has any obligation to obey that king anymore. That could lead to rebellions and problems like this. So no Western European king who was Catholic could afford to ignore the church or irritate them too much.
Because of the rebellions that they could face in their countries.
Yeah, because the Catholic Church could denounce them and then they lose all religious legitimacy. And then the people could then rebel against them. And
which happened, I mean.
Yeah, it did. It happened a few times. It happened even...
English history is...
even regardless of whether the Catholic Church excommunicated the king or not. But what happened was that because Europeans now were discovering these ancient texts, Greek philosophical texts. I mean, they weren't complete strangers to the Greek philosophy and so on, but this was kind of new thought, new thinking. Also, Muslim texts from Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and others. Right? So this started to kind of kickstart their thinking and questioning about things.
Right.
And
so we're in the Renaissance period.
Yeah, now we're in the Renaissance. So they call it the rebirth, because then you see technological innovation occurring in Europe. You see people questioning, and of course you see the infamous Martin Luther. So now we got to Martin Luther, which is around the 15th, 16th century kind of period where we're looking at. So Martin Luther sees that the church...
Just in case anyone...
Because,
there are some people that are going to be watching this thinking that the 1960s black guy...
Oh, Martin Luther King. It has happened. It has happened.
Trust
some
me,
confusions.
When I used to teach in a school, and there was a time where I had to teach Martin Luther, I was told that the first thing I've got to do is just separate them. Martin Luther, the German monk, not the black civil rights activist, 1963.
1960, yeah. No, this is very much, 14th and 15th century kind of era scenario where you have this. Okay, I'm not going to go too much. I'm not going to really go into his history so much because it's too much detail, but. He was a monk. He actually was trying to find in his a spiritual quest to find redemption and find ease with God, and he saw that the church was very corrupted. So the church could say they wanted to kind of sell indulgences. Indulgences was, they said, look, we will forgive your sins if you pay us money, and they would have like a little menu of different.
We've got that in our Ummah as well,
Really? Subhanallah. SubhanAllah.
We've got that in the Ummah, don't we? I mean, let's be honest. We have a lot of fraudster mashayikh in the Ummah like this, don't we?
Well, that's a whole different topic. For another time, perhaps. But yeah, so these they would even give like almost like menus to the
give
public,
them like a
saying
signature saying that you've been forgiven.
If you've committed adultery, here's how much you have to pay. If you've committed theft, if you've lied, if you've fought lustfully about another woman. Here's how much you have to pay. Yes. And the church was making...
Some people pay a lot of money for this.
Yeah, probably. And this was a scenario. So Martin Luther just says, this is just rubbish. Yes, like, you can't sell forgiveness.
He had his 95 thesis. He nailed it in the church door and all that history, isn't it?
But you see, here's the thing, right? The problem is that his own Bible and Christianity you could say puts a strong argument on the Catholic side, because whatever the successors of Peter promise in this world, God will fulfill in the heavens. So the Pope will say, well, if I want to sell indulgences and I'm the successor of Peter, therefore God will
succession.
Yeah, so if I forgive you, then God will forgive you.
Right.
And of course, Martin Luther says, like, why do we need these authorities?
Yes.
Why don't we just read the Bible directly? And the Catholic Church just responds, and it still responds to this very day, saying, who wrote the Bible, or who edited it and chose the books that would go in it? Us. And it only has authority because you're meant to believe as Christians that the Holy Spirit guides the church. So if you say that we don't have authority, then that book doesn't have authority, because we came first, not that book.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So it's a strong argument that Catholics use against Protestants to this very day. Anyway, so Martin Luther, he starts like preaching that the Catholic Church is corrupt, using very strong language, like it's satanic and so on and so forth. Anyway, so then some of the northern kingdoms, you get like the Scandinavian kings, you get some of the German dukes and princes, start thinking, this is actually, now we have an incentive to get rid of that meddling church that always tells us what to do, and they don't have an army, but
they have an argument to make.
Yeah.
They have scholarly backing, if you like.
To an extent. I mean, I'm sure historians will debate endlessly as to what caused it, but a lot of the people in Germany were listening to Martin Luther. So some of the dukes and princes thought, hey, it's a great idea to kind of jump on board, and I don't have to listen to the church telling me what to do anymore, like all the way in Italy and all the way in the south of Europe, right? This is like a north-south divide almost, right? Henry VIII initially was a good Catholic, and he wrote theses against Martin Luther. But of course, when the church started to dither about his divorce, which is not allowed in Catholicism, he soon saw the light and adopted. Well, he didn't adopt Lutheranism. He just created his own church.
Yeah. Church of England.
Yeah, which was identical in most of its creeds, identical in its religious practices, just that the head of the church was the king. That was it. That was the only difference initially. Right? Anyway, so Church of England, hence.
Right.
Anyway, but here's the thing: people think, oh, well, are the Protestants, are these guys now, are they just liberal? Were they turned out to be liberal? Or are they thinking in a liberal way? Is that how liberalism was formed? Say no, it wasn't, because Martin Luther and then another guy, John Calvin, as well as a guy called Zwingli, which is a Swiss kind of based reformer, as well as King Henry VIII. They believed that their interpretation of Protestantism was the best or accurate interpretation, at least for the most part. And so whenever any state adopted their particular version of Protestantism, that state would enforce it on the people. So if you're in England, you must be a follower of Church of England. You must renounce the Pope. And people were burnt at the stake for not renouncing the Pope. Thomas More, the famous Sir Thomas More, is one example. And of course, in Germany as well, in Scandinavia, and obviously in later on, and in Holland and places like this.
Queen Mary and all that.
Yeah, and even you probably know this as well. John Calvin in I think it was what was it? I actually forget the name of the city now. It's Genoa, or it'll come to me in a second anyway. John Calvin has his ideas get popular in a particular city, and he encounters this guy called Michael Servetus, who denied the Trinity. And so John Calvin basically campaigned that you have to kill this guy for denying the Christian doctrine. So these guys weren't liberal by modern standards anyway. They just believed that the state church will now be their version of Christianity. Right? So even Martin Luther, who actually was very tolerant over different versions, he said that every Christian has a right to interpret the Bible for themselves, except the Baptists and Anabaptists who were kind of like anarchists. He said, these guys you have to persecute and destroy and force them to follow non-Baptist ideas. Anyway, he still believes that you can't sin in public, right? If you basically, brothels should be shut down, prostitution should be prohibited, and adultery should be punished by death, right? Martin Luther and all his fellow reformists had the same idea. So they were not liberals. People think Protestantism and the Reformation, that's what happens. It becomes liberal. Said no, the Reformation wasn't liberal. Reformation was an attempt to reform the church, the Catholic Church. But it wasn't successful because the Catholic Church didn't change, at least not then anyway. And they even set up a counter-reformation to go against it. Well, the Reformation just means the birth of Protestants. That's literally all it means. Catholics didn't change. Those who remained Catholic anyway. Anyway, so now fast forward that a bit, you had two things that happened in Europe. So one, you had the New World, when they sailed and discovered the New World, and they wanted to create a new kind of society, and they needed settlers to basically occupy these lands. There were the most ready settlers, the most enthusiastic settlers were basically these minority Protestants who were being persecuted in majority Protestant countries, but not following the majority Protestant ideas. They were called the nonconformists. So they went to America and they had some space to believe what they believe, and they kind of started to preach that, look, why don't we have governments which don't care what particular version of Christianity you believe in, right? Like, because we're not going to rebel against the kings. We're still their good, servants, and we still are loyal to the kings. But do we have to follow the particular Protestant interpretation that the king is following, right? Why is that? Then you had things like the English Civil War, and you had the wars of religion, 30 Years' War, which was more devastating than World War II relative to the population of that time as a percentage. Right. I'd argue that maybe some historians can debate that anyway. And it was between just Protestants and Catholics. So then you had when
did the 100 Years' War happen?
Oh, the 100 Years' War was much before that. You had like Joan of Arc. That's that kind of era of time. It was yeah. So but this was much more later. So you had the 30 Years' War. It was very bloody. The Catholics wanted to destroy Protestantism. They couldn't. The Protestants wanted to defend themselves, and in some cases push out the Catholics. Sometimes they could, sometimes they couldn't. It was but it was stalemate, basically. So they came to an understanding, which is, okay, was it Quis regio, ius religio? Whoever's ruling, their religion. Generally, so okay, if the king is Protestant and he's, let's say, Calvinist, fine. If he's Lutheran, fine. If he's Anglican, fine. If he's Catholic, fine. And the majority can follow that, but the minority should be allowed to live as they wish. The minority of Christians should be allowed to live as they wish. That was a general agreement. Not all Protestants followed that, though, right? And you had that. Then you had, here's the thing. You had the rise of the sciences in Europe, right? And of course, the encounters of other civilizations, like Muslims didn't believe Christianity was the universal religion. The Chinese didn't know anything about Jesus or Christianity, except maybe from contact by Muslims anyway. And you had all these different religions. And then you had these pagan Greek thinkers whose philosophy is really interesting. And you had the rise of people who said, you know what, maybe this religious thing is all a bit of a scam, like, because we were taught that Christianity is the universal religion, yet most people don't know about it in the world and not following it, right? And others. So
now we're moving into like 1600, 1700.
15 to 1600, yeah. But of course, the society are not going to accept atheists or materialists, right? And there's a debate as to whether some people I'm going to mention now are actual atheists. But then you had the rise of people like Thomas Hobbes and Baruch Spinoza, who was from a Jewish background, but he was forced to convert to Christianity in Spain by force, and then he went to Holland.
Was Spinoza an atheist?
There's debate about that. Some people say that him and Thomas Hobbes were secret atheists, but Allahu Alam on that. Anyway, so they start to think, well, you know what? And also you have Hugo Grotius, who arose to discuss international law, which is where the idea of we have to find universal ideas that everyone can agree on in international law, right? So that people don't commit piracy or they don't invade people for no reason. And then you also had Thomas Hobbes and Baruch Spinoza talk about how do we create a state that's more stable than the Christian religion.
Social contract side coming up, isn't it?
Well, that was about to be Hobbes developed that. Yeah. Baruch Spinoza was more just looking at generally how do we create a state that's based on a different premise, because prior to that, people had based the government on on a church supporting that government. That's why it has legitimacy. That's why you shouldn't rebel against it. But the problem is, what if people don't follow that church, that particular interpretation? When I use the word church here, I mean madhab within Christianity, because that's what it means. The word church technically means jama'ah. Is their version of it, from ecclesia anyway. So they said, you know what? We can't use religious interpretations to base any state on, because there's ikhtilaf on it. Although we'll use some. We should have an idea of natural laws, right? Now they didn't invent the idea of natural law. The Greeks had some idea of it. Muslims discussed something similar to it. Even Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, who was before him, discussed something of it. But they started to do ijtihad of natural law of the universe. They said,
on this point, if my memory serves me correctly, when I was reading the Leviathan some time ago, Thomas Hobbes, he started, I think, chapter 1 with the state of nature. And what I find quite interesting is this, because I feel like this is kind of like their biological presupposition almost, or even psychosocial presupposition of the human being. So in the case of Thomas Hobbes, he's saying that human being is in a state of constant war. Human being is in a state of conflict, and that we're evil by nature, in fact, and that evilness needs to be curtailed by some other thing that then checks it. This is for those who do believe that Thomas Hobbes is the first liberal, because there's some discussion as to, is he the first liberal scholar, first liberal writer, first liberal theorist. For those who do believe that, the question of how do we substantiate such a view of human nature? I mean, it's if you think about it from even a scientific perspective, it's almost completely unsubstantiated based on the observances of Thomas Hobbes himself. The idea that human being is in this constant conflict mode and that he is evil by nature. What do you make of that?
Well, you actually ask, I think, a brilliant question, and this
Thank you very much.
No, because this is like at the root DNA of where liberalism comes from, right? Now, Thomas Hobbes, he wasn't actually a liberal by our standard, not by long shot, but he was the first secularist.
Right.
The first person to say that a state should be based on something other than religion. But he didn't specify. He believed that if you want to give your, he believed that we're all individuals. And I have a particular hypothesis on this, which is, I think he tried to apply some kind of a pseudo-scientific method, without doing any science.
He didn't do anything. Yeah.
You know what science is? Where you do experiments, you test, right? So, but for him, it was just a thought experiment, right?
Anecdote.
Yeah, he thought, okay, maybe things in nature are made up of atoms. Right. So if you break everything down, it's made up of atoms. So what science does is it takes a particular object, and it says, right, I'm going to take it out from its environment, and I'm going to subject it to experiments to find out what its nature is, and I'll do it to as many objects in the environment. And then my science will give me a picture of how everything acts together as a sum of all individual things fulfilling their own nature, or fulfilling their own drives, or what have you, or like motion, or what have you, right? So he thought, okay, maybe I'll apply that on humans. So then humans, okay, let's take the individual human, right? Well, the individual human, has its own drives, its own desires. It's not necessarily going to be the same desires as another human. That human is selfish. It only thinks about its own desires, and so in theory, then, before society, in some primeval state of nature, woolly state of nature, they must have been fighting each other constantly. So the only way that humans can then be civilized is they agree that their life as individuals would not be the best in this state of nature, because they'll be fighting each other all the time. So maybe civilization came about when they all agreed to live under a agreement where they appoint a set of rulers. They either they all rule as a pure democracy like Athens. Either they appoint an oligarchy, which is a collection of people to rule on their behalf, or one guy to rule on their behalf, and that begins a kind of a covenant. Right, so they give a bay'ah, they give their allegiance to this guy, and this guy rules them, and that's how people become civilized.
Social contract. Right.
social contact theory.
I was going to say that this. I'm not sure if you've come across this book called Lord of the Flies.
Yes, yeah, of course,
Yeah,
infamously so, yeah.
Yeah, like William Golding. This is quite similar. It's got a Hobbesian view, doesn't it? I mean, if you think about it now, I mean, these guys all together in the island and they're all fighting each other, and it's that state of nature of being an amplified hatred between people as the primordial state. I think it's taken from Hobbes. It just came to my mind, anyways. But so Hobbes came about. When did he die? I don't know. It was in 14.
It was towards the end of the 17th century, so like the end of the 1600s. He died, and John Locke kind of was came about just a bit after him, but not after he died. During his lifetime, just younger than him. And I'll get to Locke in 1 second, though. But I have another theory, which is this is just a theory, which is. I think these guys read some Islamic literature from Ibn Tufail's was it Al-Hayy bin Yasqan, I believe it is, where it talks about this one guy is stranded on a desert island, and by himself he starts learning language and comes to the belief that God exists and starts learning about science and learning about all by himself, just being purely rational. And it's meant to be a work of fiction.
Is there anything that shows that they came across Ibn Tufail's work?
Well, I mean, John Locke. Well,
what is it? Oxford University? Or?
I believe he studied with the Oxford or even taught there. But some of Thomas Hobbes's ideas seem very Islamic. I don't want to digress.
Yeah.
But he has his theory, and his theory is that where does language come from? Because a child needs to be taught language, otherwise it never develops it, right? So where does it come from?
A book, Empiricism. Also, I forget the name of the book. The essay.
Yeah, but this is still in the Leviathan. He mentions this, right?
Oh, on Thomas Hobbes.
Yeah,
Sorry,
Thomas Hobbes. No.
Yeah.
So all these names are getting confusing. But so Thomas Hobbes basically says that Adam alayhi salam was taught the names of things by God.
Yes.
But that's not in the Bible.
Really?
Yeah. But interestingly, it is in Ibn Khaldun's book, and it's also in the Quran, of course, but it's in his book Al-Muqaddimah, which was only written about, let's say, 150 years before Thomas Hobbes. So did he get it from Muslims? Allahu Alam. But anyway.
That's an interesting observation. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just my theory, it's a hypothesis, but it's not in the Bible, so where's he getting it from, right? That's an interesting question. But it's in the Quran, right?
The whole story of the beginning of the Quran.
Yeah, no, and that's why I think maybe they had some Islamic influences. But so anyway, so Thomas Hobbes thinks that humans are like atoms, and therefore a state is created to kind of civilize them, and where they all agree to kind of live together. And then when he says that, he says that should be the basis for every state. It's basically setting up a covenant, right? Right, a aqd al-haqimiyya, right? So, but then here's the thing: he believes that if the state wants to be tyrannical, if the state can do whatever it wants because everyone gave their consent to the state, so he's not liberal. John Locke then takes this idea and says, "Well, wait a second. I mean, I agree with everything else." But I think there should be limits on the state. Like if the state gets too tyrannical, if it takes away people's rights and liberties, like for no good reason, then you should be allowed to rebel against the state.
Do you think that there's, from that point onwards, that there has always and continues to be a tension between social contract rationale and the individualistic kind of model of human freedom in the face of the establishment, despite the government and so on?
Oh yeah, definitely. And that's like that's an observation which I think we can see happening even to this very day. The fight between state encroachment on individual rights and people's individual rights and freedoms, like freedom for privacy, which I don't think the NSA care about when they do kind of mass intercepts of people's bulk intercepts of people's emails and phones and so on and so forth in the United States for the sake of national security. So we'll get to that. That's a juicy topic. But anyway, so that's their argument, and they based the argument not on the Bible. They based it on this natural law that humans started out as individuals, and they were free in nature. But to kind of, because it was like, let's say, not convenient to live in that circumstance, and because they dispute and what have you, Locke then kind of says, well, the state was required to be set up to protect people. But he says the aqidah now is that people are supreme lords of their own self. And I'll give you a quote. He says,
the hedonistic principle that he talks about, isn't it?
You could say like hedonism would be the natural result of that doctrine. He said in his two treatises of government, which I know you've read because you mentioned it a few times before. He said in that book, man in the state of nature is absolute lord of his own person and possessions, equal to the greatest and subject to nobody, all being kings as much as he and every man his equal. So that's kind of where it comes from. And then he says that people should have the freedom, like in their state of nature, to pursue life, liberty, and property. But the American Constitution and the American Declaration of Independence, based on his ideas, were famously, they changed that last bit to say happiness, right? When it means property.
And pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, but it's kind of like they're linked together because pursuit of property is the happiness, as Thomas Hobbes defined. Thomas Hobbes believed that happiness is continual sensual gratification, continually basically pleasing yourself, drink that you like and eating food that you like and being with members of the opposite gender or well, he didn't say same gender, but in this day and age they'll say same gender in some cases, if that's what gives people enjoyment. Constant enjoyment is the definition of happiness. Constant consuming, constant, to your full, but constantly enjoying stuff, the physical pleasures, that is happiness. And that's where they introduced it, and that's where you aptly surmise this, you could say, the hedonistic principle. And that's basically where it came from, where it was defined. And when Christians would argue back, saying that this is against how we've done things. Like I think it was Robert Filmer.
Yeah. That's who you addressed the whole book to, isn't it?
Yeah. In response, see, Robert Filmer, he was worried about this. He said, if you basically, if you say that humans have these natural rights for freedom, then this leads to atheism, because it denies the creation of Adam alayhi salam as an obedient slave to God, as a servant of God. It denies this. If the law of nature says that humans are free, even though in nature they're not free anyway. I mean, I always make a little bit of a joke about it, that if you put a guy on a desert island with lions, tigers, and bears, are those lions, tigers, and the bears going to respect that person's right to life? No. That is going to respect them as a tasty meal. So he kind of warned that this is what's going to happen. It's going to lead to atheism, this kind of viewpoint, right?
But both, what I found quite interesting about that whole back and forth between him and Filmer was that they both tried to use biblical exegesis to prove their point. So it wasn't like John Locke was trying to argue against theology, or in his case even biblical exegesis. He was just, he reinterpreted the Bible according to his own premise, if you like.
Well, it's kind of like he gets this idea from a materialistic argument that's not even really based in science at all, just as you said, a supposition, a presupposition. He takes that, he adopts that as his aqidah, then he goes into the Bible to reinterpret the Bible to fit the belief he has on this natural law. And he argues, he says, look, the law of Moses is only for Jews. But Christians, since Paul, kind of his teachings, shows that Christians don't have to follow the laws of Moses. And he said it quite fascinatingly in, I think it was Letter on Toleration, I believe. He said, if the Jews can who have received revelation of law from God, and if they want to, let's say, kill apostates because their Bible says so, then they can do that, and that's legitimate from the Bible and from God's command, because they receive specific revelation to do that.
So John Locke,
but Christians who are not under that law anymore, and so we're not obliged to follow that law. So we should make up our own law based on whatever seems right to us.
Do you know where he says that? Because what I read, and I think chapter 19 or somewhere, the letter of toleration. I don't know how I remembered that. Might be completely wrong. Someone out there is Lockean is probably going to say, look, you're wrong about that. But that's in that chapter is where I see him talking about what he calls Mohammedans and atheists.
Yeah.
Which I found quite fascinating because he excludes atheists from public life somehow. He says that it's unacceptable to be an atheist in a sense, and he speaks in a similar tone about Muslims, which I think you've written something about. Is it correct, Cesar?
Yeah. So okay. So I wrote this article called John Locke's Dark Secret, about where he justifies killing apostates, but only Jews are allowed to do that because they have divine law. Whereas liberals today who lionize John Locke would be aghast if they knew that this was John Locke had said this. And in one of my debates, and you've mentioned, you actually remembered it accurately. So it is in Letter of Toleration. You got it right. I remember bringing this up in a debate with a American atheist. I think his name was Dr. Ed Buckner. So he kind of he believed in Locke. He was talking about Locke. He loved him, and I said, "Oh, interestingly, because Locke believed that different interpretations of Christianity should be allowed to be tolerated in a state that he proposes, but not atheists.
Yeah,
because atheists don't believe in a God. So when they make a pledge of allegiance or an agreement to abide by rules and laws, they don't believe in any higher power to guarantee that they will follow that pledge." So there's no reason for them to follow it if it no longer is convenient for them anymore, because they don't believe in a hereafter. They don't believe in divine accountability. So atheists don't have a claim for toleration.
Right.
And that was in his ironically entitled Letter on Toleration. And you were also right when you mentioned about, you remember correctly about the Mohammedans, as he calls them. So he mentions Catholics obliquely. He says, those who believe whose head of their church is a foreign power, which is like the church, like the Pope is, a foreign prince, a foreign leader, they don't deserve to be tolerated, because you can never be sure that they are going to be loyal to the Christian government, which is of a different church.
I've got a quote from John Locke, actually. If I've still got it in my notes, I'll read it out, because I think it's good that we can get, and then you can comment on it. I've got a lot of my stuff is here on my phone. Yes, it's actually chapter 19, yeah? He goes, "No opinions contrary to human society or to those moral rules which are necessary to the preservation of civil society are to be tolerated."
Yeah.
Now, the reason why I brought this quote out, because we're talking about John Locke, who is, for all intents and purposes, most philosophers would see he is the founding father of modern day liberalism. Not some would say Thomas Hobbes, but the majority would say John Locke. Yeah. John Locke is saying that there are some things, right? Some opinions, which he says, no opinions contrary to human society or to those moral rules which are necessary to the preservation of civil society are to be tolerated. So he's talking about the limits of. He's entitled this obviously the letter of on toleration, but he's really talking about the limits of toleration. He's saying, look, these are my principles. Yes, this is liberalism. Yes, however, these are the limits of liberalism, where there are certain opinions that are unacceptable to society and would therefore be rejected outright.
Yeah.
How does this contrast to somewhat what you would maybe consider as like modern day contemporary liberals? They have a completely different tone, especially because of the whole freedom of speech discussion, which has amplified this thing completely. On liberal grounds, couldn't one argue that there are certain things you could say, certain things you could do, according to John Locke, not according to me or you, right? Which should be outlawed?
Well, it's a very good observation. Basically, John Locke kind of saw that the state guarantees security. So if there's no freedom and security without the state, so if there are any ideas or beliefs that could potentially threaten the stability of the state, then that's a good reason to limit and prevent people from holding those ideas. And he also mentioned, and you were correct when you mentioned about Mohammedans, right? So he said that Mohammedans don't have a claim for toleration as well. I think
I've got the quote here. Actually,
yeah, if you can read out the exact quote so that people can.
I've got the one for atheism though.
Yeah.
It says here, those are not at all to be tolerated who deny the being of a god, promises, covenants, and oaths, which are the bonds of human society, can have no hold upon an atheist.
Yeah.
Right? He says the taking away of God, though, but even in thought, dissolves all. Besides, also those that by their atheism undermine and destroy all religion can have no pretense of religion whereupon to challenge the privilege of toleration.
Yeah.
So clearly, I mean, this is once again John Locke. He's opposing.
Actually, you know what? I got the I have the quotes here actually.
And this is in I think chapter 20 of his Tolerations.
Here you go. So he says, I'll try to I'll just talk about the Muslim side of it. So he talks about, he alludes to Catholics,
right?
And then he says, and this probably sounds like some Islamophobes today, right? He says, it is ridiculous for anyone to profess himself to be a Mohammedan only in his religion, but in everything else, a faithful subject to a Christian magistrate, which is basically his government, right? Whilst at the same time he acknowledges himself bound to yield a blind obedience to the Mufti of Constantinople, who himself is entirely obedient to the Ottoman Emperor, basically the Caliph, and frames the feigned oracles or hukums of the. He didn't use the word hukum; he says oracles, but it means ahkam of that religion according to his pleasure. And this Mohammedan living amongst Christians would yet more apparently renounce their government if he acknowledged the same person to be head of his church, who is the supreme magistrate in the state. So basically, Muslims can't be trusted because the head of their religion or their leader is the caliph. It isn't the leader of the Christian state they live in.
It's a conflict of interest.
Yes, which is why he argues that it is ridiculous just to think that we should only that a Muslim can only be a Muslim in a spiritual aspect and not in the political aspect too.
Right. So it shows you, I mean, to the extent to which liberalism is malleable from the inside and elastic, if you like, as well from its from the outset. Because obviously here, if toleration can be stretched according to public good and community interest and social interest to this extent, then to what extent is liberalism in fact individualistic in the sense that it claims to be? You know, it's going to be, as we would call it, ijtihadi, right?
Yeah.
So I got something from Mill as well. I know we're kind of skipping 200 years.
It's all right.
But this is what I found quite just interesting. I mean, I'm not sure, once again, I think I was talking to you about this before, but I'm not sure if this is authentic or not. So I have to put that as a big caveat here before I read this out. But he's talking about blasphemy.
Sure.
And blasphemy laws. And he says, yet if such prosecutions be necessary for the well-being of the community, if the prosperity of England requires that some martyrs should be made by the religion for which so many have been made in former times, then, by all means, let them continue and be multiplied, and let Christianity, which benefits the country in so many other ways, also benefit by the sacrifice of its own character for mercy, toleration, and consistency. It is, however, well worth considering whether we will be reduced to this dilemma. So in other words here, I'm not sure, once again I put this as a caveat, I'm not sure to what extent this is accurate, but what Mill seems to be indicating here as well, once again, we're fast forwarding 150 years or 200 years or whatever it may be, is that there are certain things that societally are unacceptable and therefore should be universalized in law, and those things would then be used to curtail human interaction and liberty, if you like, from an individual perspective. I've got one more example of looking at this, because that could be contested manuscript, right? But in page 166 on Liberty, very famous book, he basically, John Stuart Mill, talks about certain acts which are done publicly and not acceptable. And he talks, potentially, like, for example, about like a husband-wife having sex. I'm not sure if he talks about this himself, but I got this from a secondary source material. Maybe a husband and wife having sex in public, right? So this kind of thing, sex in public, is an unacceptable offence according to even, I think, law today. It's public.
Yes, it is.
It's not allowed for a person to just go have
even
sex
though
in
you might think it's not by some people's antics we hear about on the news and so on, but no, it's generally prohibited.
It's prohibited, isn't it? So that kind of thing. So if there is something which can be universalized in law, and enshrined in law in such a way as would prevent human beings from enacting their kind of individual or doing what they want to do individually, then according to Mill and Locke and all of those theorists, once again, there is a intrinsic malleability, or you can say such a malleability as ironically would allow for rigidity at a certain stage. You can't be free at all stages, because you could argue this doesn't harm anyone. It goes against the harm principle, right?
Yeah.
So two people having sex maybe could harm a child, but if they do it in a certain area,
Yeah.
I mean, why not?
According to their creed. Yeah.
According to their creed. And so the point I'm making is that there's always, and this is probably a good way to segue into this. There's always going to be that tension between social contract, the universality of law, and the individual self-expression. So this is a problem for liberalism, right? How do human beings sort out these things, especially when you put democracy into the equation? I mean, I think I saw you one time on YouTube. I'm not sure if this is correct. You can correct me if I'm wrong. You questioning someone on like, I think it was the Middle Eastern context, and you were talking about politics and, say for example, let's just be controversial here and let's kind of bring it out, right? I think
me controversial, never.
Let's be controversial. So one of the punitive laws of it is cutting the hand of the thief, for example, say for instance, which is in the Quran. Okay, and we're not saying it's applicable for all times and places. Certainly, we're not saying it's applicable in the United Kingdom, right? For the non-Muslims or whatever it may be, right? Or even for the Muslims. I mean, we're not going to say we're going to cut the hands off. Be with Judge Judy and executioner, Judge Jury, not Judy. That's a show.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say was that, say for instance, right? We're bringing the democratic element, right? You have a society which the majority principle dictates. For example, in a referendum, decide that this should be the method by which and through which thieves ought to be punished. Now you've got lots of tensions here. You've got the tension between the social contract, the majority principle, so-called human rights, individual human rights. Which one should take primacy in the struggle for making it onto law? What should be enshrined and become universal as law?
When people look at hudud and they think, oh, isn't that so barbaric and so on, and
Yes.
they don't look at let's say the history of English law, even during its post-Enlightenment developed stage, let's say 19th century. So
Right.
it wasn't that long ago
Right.
in terms of history.
Victorian Britain.
Yeah, if you committed theft, you could be executed, and killed, and rendered dead just for committing theft. The hudud doesn't do that. Islam doesn't say that. It's much more harsh.
Yes.
Certainly much more harsh. You also had forced labor for many petty crimes.
Yes.
So basically made into slaves.
But they'll say,
at the
look,
state's
we're moved
command.
on now. They'll say, Abdullah, look, we've moved on for that. That was something of the past.
I know, I
Right.
know, but I would argue they've replaced it with something which is still, I would argue, inhumane compared to the Sharia, the mercy of the Sharia, because the Sharia, the punishment system is it's corporal punishments, so punishment of the body, but the person is released back to their family that very day, right? Their family doesn't suffer when that person's punished. The person who commits the crime, they're punished, not their family. But in Western countries, they put people into these cages. They put humans into cages for long periods of time and have created human zoos. It's become an industry in United States of America with the highest prison population in the world, more than China.
Wow.
I mean, China's got 1 billion people.
Is that correct? Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's the largest prison population in the world.
Well, not as a ratio, as numbers of individuals there.
As numbers.
And we're paying.
I think it's
money.
over. I think it's around 1 million or so people. 1 million Americans
Wow.
are in cages.
And what I was going to say to you here, going back to the problems of liberalism,
Yeah.
because couldn't one easily argue, right? Just potentially as John Locke did, and potentially as John Stuart Mill, for all his worth, right, would indicate himself that. I mean, this might sound a bit wacky here, right? But let's bring one of the hadd min hudud al-Quran wa Sunnah, one of the punitive laws of Islam, right? Say, for example, cutting the hands of the thief.
Or you could even bring, I suppose,
execution, death penalty.
No, the flogging for zina, basically flogging for committing zina.
Yeah. According to the logic of John Stuart Mill here in page 166 of his book on liberty, if there are certain things which are unacceptable publicly, so this point here of unacceptable publicly, who's to decide? It would be either or. It would be the population and or the ruler.
Yeah.
So if it's the ruler and the population, so there's kind of like, or the majority principle if they want to bring in democracy, whatever it may be. But if that's the case, so from this logic, you can actually justify using liberal principles, couldn't you? I mean, couldn't you justify cutting the hand of the thief?
Well, they don't really have an argument. Like John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Thomas Hobbes, certainly not Thomas Hobbes either, could not actually produce any argument to actually criticize. They might say it's against our tastes to do so, but they were doing far worse in England around those times,
Right.
much worse than
colonial empire. I'm not sure what their thing was. I mean, I read it in two treatises of government. There's a lot of discussion on slavery, and obviously there's no doubt.
In the United States, they were amputating the hands of slaves that ran away and so on and so forth. Whereas in the Sharia, you can't amputate slaves and so on and so forth.
No,
right?
what I was going to say was that there's no doubt on John Locke's position, for example, on slavery. He was unequivocally against it, right? He talked about, for the most part, from what I remember.
Apparently, there's some reports of him actually having slaves, but in the Americas. But anyway,
But he did write against them, and that's from what I remember. He definitely wrote against it. Slavery as an institution and all that kind of. He definitely wrote against it. He said that human beings should never be enslaved and so on.
to an extent, but he also defended slavery in the Bible by arguing it wasn't slavery. And I think you went to my kind of Islam and slavery lecture when I brought this up.
Yes.
Where he said that if you're not allowed to execute your slave at will, and according to the laws of Moses and what have you, after I think 7 or 6 years, you release them, or they can be released if they pay off a debt or what have you. But basically, you don't have unconditional, absolute control over someone to do whatever you want. And we know that in Islam, you don't. There's prohibitions.
Like that.
Yeah. There are rights that a slave has over you. So according to John Locke, that's not slavery. So Jewish, the kind of slavery as defined in Jewish law, and slavery as they would say is in Sharia, or at least how Sharia manages it. According to John Locke, isn't slavery, and that's what he writes in his two treatises of government. That section on slavery, he writes. Yeah. He actually mentions it by name, which is something that liberals would find probably disconcerting if they knew that now. And you're right, what you've said about. These guys would not have any criticism of the Sharia. In fact, they could even argue. It could be argued that according to John Locke, an Islamic government under a caliph with implementing Sharia is a free government. It's a free state.
On the basis that he said the same thing about a Jewish government.
No, not even that. He gave a definition. So Robert Filmer argues that. Well, if you believe in freedom, you believe that people can just do whatever they want. And he rebuts in response, saying, no, I didn't say that. What I meant by freedom is that you live under a government with known laws that apply for everybody equally, where the ruler can't do anything he wants to you just because he doesn't like you. So I don't like that hat you're wearing, I'm going to kill you. He can't do that because the laws prohibit it, right? Or the laws are defined. So whatever is within the permissible area, the mubah, you have freedom. That's what he means by freedom. Well, in the Sharia, in the mubah, you have freedom as well. In what is permissible, in the halal, you can do what you wish. And that's what, according to John Locke's own argument, is freedom. Right. Because that was his only response, the only way he could perhaps respond to Robert Filmer's accusation that what you're calling for, John Locke, is anarchy. And it's like, no, not anarchy. As long as the state has common laws for everybody, then you are free within what is permitted. And that's actually, I think, Thomas Hobbes' argument, which Locke kind of continued forward.
So what problems are there in liberalism? There's been lots of books recently that's been written. This is probably one I've just kind of been looking at. It's a popular work nowadays, written by Michael Sandor. It's usually in green and blue, I think.
Yeah.
bring a cover. This is more. I mean, he's not fundamentally against liberalism in the same way as, I don't know, Carl Schmitt would be, or something like that, or someone who really attacked liberalism for its core values, who lived in Germany. But Michael Sandor is talking about the limits of justice. This spurred what's referred to as the communitarian individualistic debate, which kind of went on in the 1980s. These are some kind of, I don't know if you want to call them ontological, or even sociological kind of criticisms against individualism in particular. Apart from this kind of popular debate, what other things are problematic in liberalism?
Well, now, as they say in UK, we're getting to the meat and vegetables of the the point. I mean, okay, so all this theory about can't we live in a state where people can do what they want as long as they don't topple the government or anything that is defined as toppling the government, even indirectly and unintentionally, like ideas or beliefs or religions, where we can all interpret the Bible as we see fit without killing each other and fighting each other, without stealing each other's property. Doesn't that sound reasonable when you first hear it, not knowing anything else about reality, humans, society, whatever? So, well, yeah, it sounds reasonable to fix the problem that Europe had with instability in their governments due to clashes between rival Protestant factions and Protestant minorities. But here's the thing. And just to actually, before I forget, because it just came to my head, when John Locke talked about atheists should not be tolerated, he was instrumental in the formulation of the Constitution of Carolina, of the first 13 colonies in the United States. And in that, it says that freedom should only be allowed to someone who believes in a God. Right? So anyway, so it actually was politically implemented by his hand, at least by his instigation. So anyway, before I kind of digress. So the problems of liberalism are what happen when you take this theory about humans as atoms in their natural state, and a government just being a way to prevent them from bumping into each other, and thinking that should be sufficient, and then applying it on reality of what humans are like, and the reality of human nature, and the reality that humans are not individuals in the sense of atoms that don't need each other, don't depend on each other, don't affect each other, short of physical harm, and you just see problems developing, constant problems developing. So I'll give you kind of the clearest example of this. So they thought everyone, Adam Smith, his economics, he thought everyone should be allowed to use their property, invest it where they like, and make money and use resources that they can seize if no one else is using those resources, or it's given to them with consent, right? So they've given to them consent, that's fine. Okay, sounds interesting, sounds fine, sounds fair. There are aspects of Islamic economics that are similar to that, free trade where you can trade things, when someone has to consent before you enact a trade, obviously. But here's a problem, which is that sounds great if we all start off with the same resources, right? Say that I have one farm and you have 10 farms, and I want to start selling my produce. And you want to start selling your produce, but you have 10 farms, right? And with 10 farms, you can sell much larger produce and get a higher margin off that, more profit from it, right? Even if you were to sell, let's say, I'm just going to make it up, let's say tomatoes, right? Let's say you were selling it at £1 a kilogram, and I was selling it at £1 a kilogram, but you sell 10 farms worth of tomatoes, right? You get lots of money. Whereas I, with maybe making 10 kilograms of tomatoes, let's just say, I only make a limited amount of money to support me and my family. You want to make more money. So I'm your competition. So you can decrease the price a bit because you still you're selling hundreds of kilograms. So the markup, let's say you make the markup is much more, and you can survive decreasing it a bit because you still feed your family with 10 farms. I can't compete with that because if I decrease it, my family starves. So then people will buy your produce. They won't buy my produce.
Right.
Either I have to decrease my tomatoes,
Yes.
or I have to sell my farm to you and do something else,
Right.
because I can't compete.
Right.
And that's what happens, and it's concentration of wealth starts to occur. There was this, they call it now the human economic problem. This is all based on Thomas Hobbes's kind of inadvertent ideas on human satisfaction. He said that humans have infinite needs and there are limited resources.
Yeah. It's
right?
a basic economic problem, isn't it?
Anyone watching this who studies at university,
Right.
you'll be taught this.
The first day you come in.
Yeah, you'll be taught this. You'll be taught this like it was gospel, right? right? The gospel truth, right?
Yes.
So
I remember actually when I was doing an A-level in economics, there was a book that they gave us. It was quite a thick green book. And that's the first chapter, called The Basic Economic Problem. Resources are finite and wants are infinite.
yeah. So the only solution, they said, is to maximize production as much as possible, and hopefully, if you can imagine like a little pyramid,
Right.
you would pull the raw resources in. The people at the top of the society, the rich, the aristocrats, yeah, they would get some of it, but it would then trickle down, the trickle down effect, and everyone
Will get better.
would get it. So if those at the bottom aren't getting enough resources, you have to just keep feeding in resources at the top.
Which is very much the supply side argument, isn't it? Against, Adam Smith's kind of argument against John Keynes and other economists.
Yeah, so Keynes came later, but that was his argument against, I believe it was British mercantilism, where Britain was trying to control export and imports to gain power against their rival nations. And
Right.
Adam Smith said, look, don't control it. Let the free hand of the market,
the invisible hand.
the invisible hand,
Right,
yeah,
right.
his God, basically, his ilah, right? Because it will go for the benefit of society.
Yeah.
So companies that aren't doing so well should be allowed to die, basically, and those because their model might not be the best. Whereas those who have a good model should be allowed to survive,
Right.
and there should be no interference.
Yes.
But the problem is, this caused the beginning of busts. Right,
Yes.
where basically you had financial bubbles develop, resources get put in, stock market speculation. Okay, long story short, the concentration of wealth.
Boom and bust.
Yeah, concentration of
issue,
wealth
yeah.
happens so.
Which is what we're kind of living in right now, isn't it?
Yeah, the boom and bust cycle, which happens.
Gordon Brown said he'll fix it.
Huh?
Gordon Brown said he'll fix it. He said he'll
Good luck.
Yeah,
Don't.
No.
We had these up and down crashes because the rich will get richer and richer, and as
Yeah.
more resources come in, they just buy more of it because they have more spending power to buy more of it,
Yeah.
and those at the bottom actually are less likely over time to get access to these resources. So much so
Well,
that
this was the debate in the 80s, wasn't it? Like in America and in the UK, because I remember even just recently, I don't know why I was doing this, but I was watching some parliamentary question time of Margaret Thatcher, and she was, because at this time was big polarization between kind of obviously socialist kind of Labour politicians and obviously Margaret Thatcher, right-wing politician in every sense of the word almost. And she answered a question about this, and she said that but this is the argument, right? This is that if we're getting the inequality, is true that there is inequality. I think she acknowledges that the inequality
it's
becomes
hard to deny.
right, but she says that everyone's getting richer though. That's the argument they use. So in a sense, absolute poverty becomes more limited, whereas relative poverty becomes exacerbated. So it's kind of like the trade-off, if you like.
Well, I mean, let's look at it firstly globally. And so what we're seeing is that in this day and age, and Oxfam has reported this repeatedly, 50% of the world's population only have 1% of the world's wealth.
Right.
Whereas 1% of the world's population, the top 1%,
Yes.
has close to 30, in some estimates, 50% of the world's wealth.
Yes.
That's globally.
Yes.
You're seeing famines in Africa and extreme poverty that never existed in their history.
Right.
And you know that the famous report where there was a time of famine and drought in Medina, and basically Muslims from the provinces of Egypt Africa sent food aid outside itself to other people in need, right? This didn't happen before you had colonialism, exploitation, and the creation of cash cropping, where basically they said, we'll give you loans, don't instead of having farms to feed yourself, sell these cash crops like coffee, which are high demand globally. You'll make profit, and then you can import food. And that sounds great until the West obviously created multiple people selling the same coffee around the world, and then they could pick the cheaper price, and those they didn't pick, after giving them money to sell them cash crops, became poor and collapsed. That's a whole different discussion. Right. But a lot of the poverty in the world, sure, we might have more technology, more resources, but you're seeing malnutrition the problem. Right. You're seeing people who don't have enough food to feed themselves in this country, with food banks are on the rise. True. Right? And of course, if you want to look at, people might access cheap food. There is cheap food, yes, but it's also unhealthy food, deliberately so, made from a lot of artificially produced ingredients and trans fats and fried foods that you get in these shops, which is only food available to poor people, and they get fatter and they will die at a much earlier age than people who are middle class or upper class. And this is happening in one of the world's top economies, the UK. Wow. Right? These are the kind of problems. So when people say, can you give us a sign that liberalism actually failed? It's not failing, is it? Like, we're still ruling by it. Actually, in theory, and it's going to might shock you, it failed and was recognized to fail approximately 100 and 150 years ago. That's what you might call libertarianism.
So are you talking here about economic liberalism?
About pure liberalism.
So supply side economics? Because here the discussion has been about kind of economy for the last
because that's one of its most obvious manifestations, right? Was economy.
That's really like the backdrop of the whole Communist Manifesto. And I remember Karl Marx actually wrote The Jewish Question, and this is something he wrote. I've got something of him. It's an interesting objection to liberalism. And he says,
by the way, I think it's going to turn into a two-parter. I can see.
I'm going to praise that. He says that he's in The Jewish Question. He says that liberal rights are egotistical rights of separation, which is, I thought, quite a powerful statement. And he says that man treats other men as means. Listen to what he says. This is Marx, Karl Marx. And obviously, we're going to have people in the right wing saying, look, they're quoting Karl Marx, maybe they become communists. We're not communists, but we, as the Prophet told us, as Imam Malik, right? Imam Malik says, كُلُّ إِنسَانٍ يُؤْخَذُ مِنْهُ وَيُرَدُّ عَلَيْهِ. Everyone you take from them, and you... So anyways, Marx says, I think he spoke the truth in this one. He says, man treats other men as means, degrades himself to a means, and becomes the plaything of alien powers. So it's a really powerful way of kind of categorizing.
He was referring to the plight of workers in a factory that basically they spend all this time in the factory working, and the fruit of their labors is mostly enjoyed in the profit that the factory owner makes, whereas they get
the surplus,
a very surplus effort or surplus value.
Surplus value.
This caused workers to be alienated from themselves and from their work, because if I did handicrafts and I make something and I sell it to you, I'm having this relationship with you where I've made this and you valuing it and you're giving me the rewards of my labor directly, and I'll give you the object, and that's a personal relationship that we're having. But if I'm now just working in some workstation making products, I don't see who it goes to, and I'm being exploited, for hours a day doing loads of these products, and the consumers have no relationship with me, and I'm not really being fully rewarded for my work, because that product will be sold for much more, and the profit will go to the factory owner, then I'm alienating myself. I'm being alienated from myself. Without going into too much of a segue, Karl Marx, he started out from the premise of individualism. Right, he just.
You think so?
Yeah. I mean, the whole point about self-alienation was from individualism. He just ended up at a different conclusion in his thinking, where he said that individuals are actually the product of the means of production, of the technology to produce resources or transform resources into goods. Their culture and their thinking and their thoughts are only related to what was the means of production in their time, and they don't control their religion or their beliefs, or they conform to society. So they're in a society. Society came first, not the individual, so to speak, every human being except the first human beings, whether he believed in the first human beings or not. So obviously, Adam alayhi salam. But everyone, for everyone after that, so to speak.
Yeah. He was around at the time of Darwin, wasn't he?
Yes, yeah. But the thing is, what made him popular was because at that time there was severe poverty. Charles Dickens wrote his kind of different wonderful literature on Oliver Twist and what have you, right?
You have to give it to him.
Yeah, but do you notice the imagery, the stark imagery of society his time? There were people who were like women so drunk that they basically let their babies die on their laps. Because they were so poor, and they would drink to kind of to forget about their miserable lives, and people whoring themselves just to feed their families in England, right? Poverty, malnutrition, people dying of malnutrition in England. So all this came to a head due to concentration of wealth. That you had, this guy called. I mean, well, that happened before that. This was after the Industrial Revolution. All these problems were still happening, even though you think it doesn't need to happen.
1800s.
Yeah, they had factories. Yeah, I mean, steam powered and
that
so on.
Stuff was going on. Yeah.
So what they realize is that this is not working out. A truly free market isn't working out. And then it was causing riots, and people, and they were also worried that people would adopt communism as well. And so they thought we need to begin regulating the economy. And then you had the birth of Keynesian economy from John Keynes, who came along and said and suggested that regulating the economy to stop the busts being so bad, and to prevent people who just speculating for stocks and shares to cause market crashes,
like we had in 2008.
Yeah, but they're talking about back then. Right, you understand these kind of things, and so that was what you'd say was the end of pure liberalism.
Do you know what I find really interesting? I find the fact that economic liberalism is very similar to its social counterpart, in so much as, boom and bust. Let's just take that as like an analytic point of discussion for a second, because what is boom and bust? The economy gets very rich all of a sudden, and then becomes, goes into a deep recession or even depression, as happened many times in history. It's basically the character. If you were to personify this model, it would be like a drunk man. You have a good night out, and then you have a what do you call it?
You spend all this money on drinks.
Hangover.
Then, you have a hangover, and you're broke. You can't buy any food.
You have
the
a
next
hangover.
day.
Exactly. Isn't that right? So the economy is like, and this character, if you like, of economic liberalism, of the drunk man syndrome, becoming very happy and very high, maybe taking drugs, getting really high really quickly, immediate gratification, and then sudden drop. It's not only just manifesting itself on an individual level, but on an economic level. And what I find amazing, and potentially this could be a segue into the last part of this discussion, because it has been quite fruitful. I mean, I'm sure the viewers will concur with that. I think
they're gonna have to rewatch this again a couple times. Yeah,
but is the Islamic solution, because, like, for example, looking at Surah Al-Hashr, I think it's chapter 59 of the Quran. Well, Allah subhanahu حتى لا تكون دولة بين الأغنياء منكم. So it doesn't become. So Allah is talking about distribution.
A circuit amongst.
Right. So it doesn't become a circulation among the aghniya, the elites amongst you. Right. So the Quran and the Hadith gives us a model, economic model, right? And I'll just kind of give this to you, and maybe you can run away with it. It gives us an economic model which is certainly not supply side from a Thatcherian perspective or a supply side perspective, but it's certainly not communistic as well. I mean, it's not a communist system. You couldn't even argue it's a socialist system. You could say it has a robust redistribution model through zakat, through other things as well. I mean, one which is, obviously there's no interest in the Islamic State. In Islamic, we're not allowed to deal with interest, which of course, I mean, any economist would tell you is speeding up that high, speeding up that boom, and speeding up that bust as well, right? Yeah. Imagine an economy without interest, with a robust redistribution model, but not so intrusive as to take 50, 60, 70% of your income. Doesn't that sound like the middle ground approach here? That if we try it out, we're not saying that it will, completely delete boom and bust, because it's very difficult to. It's life. You're gonna have boom and bust, but we'll moderate it.
It won't be so large.
Yeah.
The dips and troughs.
Yeah.
And, you're right. In fact, it's a good way to I suppose simplify it to a non-Muslim when they ask about this and say, look, it's between the extremes of capitalism, which is the economic system of liberalism,
Yes.
and communism, which is the other extreme, where it's like the market's controlled purely by the government.
Right.
So let's take example. So riba, right? It's an interest.
Yes.
So it's basically I give you a resource, and then after a period of time, you give me back the resource with extra, right? But of the same resource, which is the definition, the legal definition of what riba would be.
Yes.
And in that circumstance, what you'll get is this: if you have a society whereby, imagine you have this top tier, and they are the bankers and the rich investors, entrepreneurs, people who have money. So the people at the bottom don't have money to kind of set up small businesses or what have you. So those at the top say, you know what, we'll lend you money for you to do your businesses, and then after a period of time, you give us it back, right? Okay, and maybe on many levels, many of these individuals will make up very successful smaller businesses where they trade amongst their fellow lower class selves of that economic class. That's fine. But here's the thing. Ultimately, they have to give back that money plus extra.
Right.
Where's the net flow of money going? It's going from the bottom to the top, not from the top to the bottom.
Right.
So gradually, the top will get more and more of the money in that society.
Which is what happens, right?
Yeah, which is exactly what happens. And also, there's something else called so Islam prohibits that. So Islam just off the bat, this is haram. Because it's not trade.
So imagine having no bankers. Or you'd have bankers, but you would have no... you wouldn't have those bankers. Right now, what's running the economy, in addition to the political class, let's be honest, bankers are doing... They're pulling the... You could even argue the political strings in many cases. Lobby groups are connected to... Imagine having those bankers that are moving things around so much, having a much less influence, right? Because of the... more egalitarian economic system that you'd have in place.
Well, they'd have even less influence, considering that once a caliph who's been vetted while he was a candidate as being competent and adil and just and what have you. It hasn't always been perfectly applied in Islamic history, but you've had caliphs held to account, impeached. Many Ottoman caliphs were removed from power by the Sheikh al-Islam, the Qadi al-Quda, right? Anyway. He doesn't need money for an election campaign. He doesn't need to listen to rich people at all whatsoever. So you can't be influenced by lobbyists who have more influence than the voters.
Yeah, it's not. They're going to say now you want a caliph in London.
No. I'm saying
we knew you had a political.
Yeah,
you could run as a.
Yeah, but you know what? The thing is that. Look, they don't need if they don't believe in Islam. Obviously, they ain't going to apply the Islamic system.
Yeah, of course not.
But it doesn't mean Islam's system isn't superior in this. We don't have this problem.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. This is how it is. You might not believe in Islam, but this is the situation.
These are the facts.
So the caliph can't be influenced. And I always say, I've always said previously, it's not one man, one vote. It's £1, $1, one vote. You understand? Because these politicians know that they ain't going to get into power if they don't have an electoral campaign, and electoral campaign costs a lot of money.
Yes.
So who are they going to listen to? It's not the people.
Right.
They're going to listen to the bankers and the political lobbyists and these all corporations who gather together. They'll scratch their back, and they'll have to scratch theirs later when they get into power. This is like well known.
Everyone knows that. Yeah.
And the only time they listen to the people is only to know what they want to hear in order to get into their office, and then they have no obligation to follow to any of their promises.
Manifesto means nothing legally. It's not legally binding.
It's not a binding contract. Not a aqd al-nikah or something. Yeah, can't make him do what you want. So that was that issue. And just to lightly touch on something else, there's also something called fractional reserve banking, which is people basically. Bankers realized because they can loan money out and for riba, right? Bankers realized that if you lend money out, people will store that money in a bank, and so collectively speaking, people will store that. So you lend money out, they will store it in a bank, and then that bank realized it can relend out that money and then whoever they lend it out to will have to store it in their bank. And collectively speaking, they realized they could lend out the same amount of money 12 or 13 times, right? The same amount of money, literally making money from nothing. And just lending it. And they said it balances the books because ultimately when it gets paid back, it will balance the books. But here's the problem. This means that if everybody cashed the money they have in their account at the same time, the entire state economy would collapse. And this has happened many times. And when it gets that far, the government will ban people from taking out money to prevent complete collapse. You also have bubbles that are created where people invest this debt into housing, like what happened in America that started the 2008 crash, right? And when these houses default on the debt being paid back, then people want their money back. The debtors want their money back. There's no money to pay them, and then they realize there's basically 11 or 12 out of the dollars they thought they had in the bank don't exist anymore, right? And the last point of that is that in essence, because they lend it out so much, so there's not enough money in the economic system to pay back the debts, because you're not having to pay back the bank the
And that's
debt
what
of
happened
the
in
original
2008,
amount.
isn't it?
Yeah, which so basically, the only reason why Western civilization doesn't collapse is that people don't instantly demand their money back or take their cash out at the same time. If ever they did that, it would be a complete and catastrophic collapse. And it's happened on individual cases in countries which have adopted this system around the world. Yeah, Argentina and other such places in the past. So that's the economic system put aside. Islam.
How does it solve this?
Well, it prohibits riba, for one
Which
thing.
is interest.
Yeah, and the Quran has a beautiful, argument against this, because people said, "Oh, how is it? How is this just not? This is not our free trade, right? I make a contract with you, I give you money, you give me money back." And it seems very brief if to someone who just cursory reads it when in the Quran it says that Allah has He has permitted trade and prohibited interest, right? Because we know the distinction between the two. We know the distinction. That's not trade.
Yes.
Riba is not trading commodities, so then it should have no use in an ecosystem. Islam views the economic problem as humans have actually finite needs and infinite luxuries. So if you can guarantee everyone has their needs satisfied, then you can let them fulfill their luxuries. You don't need a Lamborghini, right? But if you can guarantee everyone has food to eat, shelter, clothing, and as the Prophet Mohammed ﷺ said, that the son of Adam has no better right than food to eat and clothing to clothe his back and to hide his nakedness, and there's many other hadiths which say similar, which is like bread to eat and food and clothing. And also even we are common partners in pastures and fire, which is energy, right, which we need to heat our homes. So if you guarantee everyone their needs, then you can allow people who have different strengths and weaknesses naturally to pursue luxuries. Communism said everyone should get exactly the same thing. It doesn't matter if you're a doctor, you're a genius physicist, or you work in a shopping mall, right, behind a counter. You all get the same amount of money.
You're trying to demote from the cashiers there? And
Nothing wrong with it, but it requires a bit more training to be a doctor. So the communists realized that they couldn't motivate people to make good quality products because whatever they do, they get the same amount of money. So what's the point of doing your job well? What's the point of even being a doctor or even being a physicist or motivating to or trying to improve? And so they had to resort to threatening people to send them to gulags or killing their family to motivate them because they weren't motivated because they weren't going to get any. There was no profit incentive. But Islam has this beautiful balance where the state will ensure that distribution of resources that everyone's needs are met.
Yes.
And then luxuries, it's laissez-faire. Do as you wish. And in fact, I would argue Islam is actually has a more free market than Western systems after Keynesian economics, because Islam doesn't say, okay, go out and trade. But here's a whole bunch of regulations. When you trade it in this way, and if you're going to do stocks and shares, no insider trading, and no this, no that, and you can only charge limits of this amount and that amount. All these regulations. In Islam, it's like no interest, no monopolies, and now everything's mubah. Go out and trade. Go out and do no regulations else required. Go out and trade. As long as you don't cheat people in the marketplaces by fraud and what have you, then go out and trade freely. That's more freedom then the Keynesian economic system that we have, or what I call second wave liberalism, the second edition liberalism, which is social liberalism, which is what we're under now.
So you talked about some of the solutions regarding economic liberalism,
Yeah.
capitalism, in a way, supply side economics, whatever you want to call it. What about social liberalism? We talked about some of the problems involving some of the tensions, social contract versus individual rights, some of the issues like, the founding fathers talking about things which in today's world will be seen as illiberal, to say the least. What are the solutions that Islam offers that will fill in the ideological chasm there created by liberalism?
Okay, well, let's go through them, and we touched upon John Locke's intolerances and so on. This has been carried on to today, because he no longer calls it's no longer atheists that shouldn't be tolerated, but now we have government saying extremism or extremists, and they don't say violent extremists; they say even non-violent extremists, and they're a threat to social cohesion. They're not loyal to the state; they're a fifth column, and it's not just Muslims they've historically spoken about, but 100 years ago, people in England were saying the same arguments about not trusting Jews. Winston Churchill,
the Jewish question, they called it.
Winston Churchill wrote an article, I believe, if I remember it correctly, called I think it was on international Jews and national Jews. So he said that there are many Jews who basically they view their community as the international Jewish community, and so you can't trust them for loyalty to the state that they live in. And they adopt ideologies. They tend to adopt ideologies which are basically we view to be dangerous, like communism. He said, "How comes communists?"
Did you write this before? Obviously, this would have been written before the state of Israel's.
This is before the state of Israel. Yeah,
because he was in power twice, wasn't he?
Yeah, and this was at the start of the 20th century. So he was having the same suspicions of Jews as many politicians have of Muslims today. Same arguments being used. So that how come? Okay, sure, not all Jews are communists, but how comes a strong majority or disproportionate majority of communists are Jews? This is what he argued, casting suspicion against Jews. And he argued that, but we do have national Jews who basically are loyal to the state. They don't care about international considerations, and they live here peacefully. And their religion is only just a spiritual kind of religion. They don't look at politics and so on and so forth. Again, the same arguments they say about Muslims today. Catholics before that, in England as well, they were saying we can't trust Catholics. Catholics are loyal to a pope, a foreign leader, and we have to make Catholics swear allegiance to the crown and renounce the pope, and that was instituted many laws. They were also called the Catholic testing laws, which was this all 19th century, 1800s, which basically up into the 1800s, which said that basically Catholics couldn't take positions in government or in certain professions. They weren't allowed. They were meant to be kept powerless, because it was scared that, or they might get larger and take over the state and uprise against the state. So liberalism has a vein of intolerance throughout its life. It can't tolerate other ways of life, other ideologies. How does Islam solve this problem? Right?
Which is really ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is the issue of having a universal. It's the universality of liberalism entails intolerance in its essence, because if you're saying that it should be this way, then you're going to have to, in a sense, suppress all the other ways. If you want liberalism to continue being supreme, especially on a political level, so that's really a contradiction, isn't it? Because how can you actually work in a system where, if the universality of liberalism indicates individual self-expression, and individual self-expression is social contracted into the universality of law, how are these two things compatible in essence? How is how is the fact that now you have a government that wants to enforce against the will compatible with a person who wants to express against the government?
Well, I'll give you a quote. So a liberal multiculturalist called Bhikkhu Parekh said, he's a professor of political theory at the University of Hull. He said, he talked about his fellow his fellow multiculturalists, some of our top liberal multiculturalists, Will Kimlicker. So he says, Will Kimlicker, Walzer, and myself, we basically have an agreement. And he said, if certain values are universally held to be valid, then no individual can be allowed to consent to their violation. So what they mean by
once again, with this logic, punitive laws of Islam.
They could outlaw expressions of Islam which are contrary to liberal values. They could outlaw it from their own ideology, and in history they've outlawed things that they've held to be similar. What they mean by multiculturalism is they mean if you want to have a curry, have a curry. If you want to dress a certain way, as long as it's your choice and you're doing it purely because it's a fashion statement and you feel nice doing it, then that's fine. That's fine. But if you're doing it because you think there's a higher power than the individual, or you're expressing alternative ways of life which are not liberal, or we're going to have a problem with you. And look at France. A liberal secular state outlawed niqab in public. Even though they didn't outlaw people wearing masks for parties, right? Outlaw wearing hijabs in the schools, basically. And of course, education is mandatory. So you're pretty much, unless they allow homeschooling, they're forcing women to basically take off their hijabs going into school. Because they said it's religious clothing with a political significance, and that meets the clause, the liberal intolerance clause. Oh, it's political, of a different ideology. Now we don't tolerate it. And so, are you expressing? It's expression of your own, fashion. Well, that's fine, but we don't trust you on this. So we're gonna ban it. Banning minarets in Switzerland, and also they're looking at banning circumcision pretty soon, and many other cases. And of course, England is putting money into counter extremism and preventing people from having the same opportunities to speak at university platforms and from expressing their opinions. They had difficulty trying to put in laws, mainly because many of the people on the right and also some atheists and liberals were worried that it might affect them. But no one has said, no, don't implement these laws that prohibit speech or subject people to control orders that preventing them from accessing the internet or even going outside their house. Not because they're Muslim. They don't say that. They say, no, don't do this because we're worried it will affect us. That's their argument, right? So
the Islamic solution.
The Islamic solution is, subhanAllah, it's actually really elegant.
Go ahead.
It's the Ahl al-Dhimma, right? The Ahl al-Dhimma. You know what's interesting?
They'll say, hold on now. They'll say, look, you're talking about the jizya that you give to the discriminatory tax that you give to those.
Well, you know what? Then my explanation of Islamic government is actually, you could argue, a multitude of governments and communities. You see, an Islamic government towards non-Muslims is only going to give them the minimum of protection from each other and from outside invaders. So the tax is required to provide that minimum protection from outside invaders and obviously from criminals amongst each other, Muslims or non-Muslims, whoever, right? Which is what Jacques Rousseau was on about. This is the contract. Yeah, Ahl al-Dhimma can be translated as contract citizen. Jacques Rousseau's. So they don't have an argument against it because according to the theories of liberalism, everyone in the West is dhimma of the government.
So long as they're submissive to the laws.
Well, here's the thing, right? So there's a caveat to this. And this is where the beauty of Islam lies as well, is that the Sharia does not expect non-Muslims to abide by it because they don't believe in it, right? There are conditions, but there is generally that a Christian is not going to be punished for drinking alcohol or for eating pork. And there are cases of basically wine presses in medieval Iraq under Islamic times. It's like, what's wine presses doing in an Islamic? You think, wow, and pig farms. And you see many Islamic scholars talking about walking through and just saying, oh, the pig farm there, oh, it's a winery there. But in Christian areas, in Christian towns and places, right? And in cities, you had Christian quarters and Muslim quarters, and there was no restriction. You could walk in between freely. But within that quarter, it was understood that that community is their own jurisdiction.
Right. So what you're saying here, because we, especially in the Western world, people have this kind of need almost. It's a quick kind of trigger reaction to categorize government. So they'll say it's a authoritarian government, it's a democratic, it's a liberal democracy, it's a communist government, and so on. But the reality is, from what we're describing here, both in relation to a liberal government, so-called liberal or self-claimed liberal governments, like the ones we have in the Western world, it's not one thing at all. I mean, we're saying it could have aspects of liberalism, but it could also have aspects of or the extension of liberalism, which is pluralism, right? Has aspects of authoritarianism, because that's when the social contract's in place, where now the individual is restricted in the face of the government with the enforcement power and with the legitimate mandate to enforce that power. That's more authoritarianism than it is liberalism. But by the same token, what we're saying is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that Islam as a system of government also has a kind of pluralism in it, because it gives people like Jewish community or Christian community, for example, it gives them their own space to operate. But at the same time, we don't shy away from saying that there are authoritarian elements as well, in so much as that there are certain things in the Islamic government which, frankly, are enforcement orientated, or are government centric, or are leadership centric, rather than geared towards individual needs, wants, and so on.
Well, I mean, the reason why I wouldn't use the word authoritarian is, firstly, it has
connotations,
no clear meaning, and it has negative connotations, which I don't think apply. Because if I was going to use the Greek system of classification of governments,
oligarchy and monarchy, and all,
it would be a nomocracy, which is nomos, rule of law. So the Sharia is the law. If the Caliph disobeys the Sharia, he can be impeached.
Would you use the word theocracy?
No, because
of the historical connotations attached to that, or
because the Greeks would define as a theocracy something where it's a rule of a priesthood.
Okay.
But we don't have a priesthood in Islam, and so there's no. Whereas, let's say the Catholic Church, like the papal states back in the day, where the Catholic Church controlled a few states directly in Italy, those are theocratic governments, because it's a priesthood who they make up any rule or law they want, and they say, but because I'm a priest, I represent God's will, and therefore this is the will of God.
In kind of British history, you had like the whole divine right thing with kings. I mean, they said that that was referred to sometimes as
theocracy. In theory, England is a theocracy because the head of the church is also the head of state.
But
it's not. In practice, it's secular. Whereas in Islam, the Caliph he's subject to the same laws as every other citizen. So he can't go outside that law at all. And so it's not authoritarian, because authoritarian would mean a government can make laws by diktat. And it has authority because the government can say whatever it wants,
right,
and it establishes itself by pure physical force. It has no legitimacy. Whereas in a caliphate system, so towards Muslims,
right,
the caliph has legitimacy, which is also conditioned upon the caliph implementing or guarding over the application of Sharia in the system.
So authoritarianism wouldn't be a good term.
No, it would be a good term for the current regimes in the Muslim world, but not for a caliphate.
Yeah.
Whereas from the perspective of non-Muslims, the caliphate would be a pluralist state, because the caliphate won't demand on non-Muslims to be Muslim, nor to follow Islamic rituals, nor to fast during Ramadan, nor to abstain from drinking alcohol and pork. There might be some compromises regarding like don't start taking wine into a Muslim area and start swilling it around everywhere and what have you. But
and frankly, and let's not beat around the bush with this one as well. The idea of blasphemy.
Yeah.
That is a clear line of demarcation as well, which the West allows, and in this context wouldn't be allowed. For example, cursing God, cursing one of the prophets. This is completely off limits.
Well, I would say the West has its own kind of versions of blasphemy, but I'll get to that in a second. Well, I was going to make a funny anecdote that in Northern Ireland and in parts of the United States, you're not allowed to walk around with visible alcohol. Right, and I like to joke that this is creeping Sharia, but in terms of a UK law and in law in America, this has been their law for like centuries.
Yeah.
Right, it's nothing to do with Sharia. but they prohibit people from walking around with alcohol, which is why if you walk around with alcohol bottle, you see them wrap some paper around it, because then it's kind of like plausible deniability. You know, the police will have an excuse not to bother you because you're not showing alcohol, you're not walking around with it in public.
I was wondering why they were doing that.
Yeah, that's why. That's why. So, and in Northern Ireland of all places as well, you can't walk around with alcohol. Anyway, so we talk about blasphemy law. So in Islam, you're allowed to, for sincere intellectual purposes, debate and question anything you want. Muslims can do it, non-Muslims can do it. You can question anything you want, right? You can frame any question you want in any way if you're seeking the truth. No problem. Public debates, Abu Hanifa was famous for having public debates with atheists. In Baghdad. So there's no problem. But
I think this guy Abu Ala al-Marri, he's a famous poet, probably one of the most famous. I think he was an atheist. I don't know.
Well, there's quite a few. I mean, Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi was also famous for having back and forth criticisms and book publishings against Jews and atheists who were responding and criticizing Islam.
I thought you were going to say something about Ibn Hazm there being an atheist.
No. He's Andalusi.
So you have a connection with him.
Andalusi connection. No, anyway. I'll say but Islam, and here's the beauty of it again. Islam says for open speech, and you have the freedom to speak within the realm of intellectual debate, discussion to pursue truth. No problem.
Yeah. And even in the case of, like for example, a Christian saying something like, in the Quran, it's very definitive of the non-divinity of Jesus Christ. For example, we see it as blasphemous as saying God doesn't exist. And of course, we can't say to an atheist, don't say God doesn't exist if that's what you believe. And that's the whole la ikraha fi d-din, no compulsion of religion thing. Yeah. So, but the idea of mocking now, right, is what we're talking about. So mocking,
gratuitous insult, whereby you say, "Oh, I think your belief. I think this guy or this guy in your belief. I think he's like a dumb, stupid, like charlatan from Satan or something like that, right?" And even in those cases, Muslims give a lot of latitude. And certainly the Hanafi school, even more than the rest, even more so than the rest, gave a lot of latitude, because you had St. John of Damascus, called St. John of Damascus because he was during Islamic Syria, and he wrote one of the first attacks against Islam.
He said he didn't convert because of the crucifixion. Is that the reason he gave, I think?
I mean, he cited a number of reasons, and he considered Islam to be a heresy, and he said it was a heresy he said that Islam was the spawn of Satan, and he wrote this book in Islamic Syria, right? Nothing happened to him, all right? There was some later Christians who tried to kind of for propaganda purposes, said, "Oh no, the Muslims they didn't like it, so they cut his hand off." But because people know that he died with both hands,
maybe he stole
they said, they said, "Oh no, it was a miracle because his hand grew back." But he died with both hands. Oh no, that was a miracle because his hand grew back. Right? So that was Christian. That was Western European propaganda against Muslims. But nothing happened to him. Muslims didn't persecute him. So here's the thing, and I make this challenge out, and I've debated liberals on this. I say what is the point or purpose of freedom of speech? Why freedom of speech? Tell me why is it allowed?
Mill says it's the pursuit of one of the main reasons, pursuit of truth.
Yeah. In fact, he only discusses it as a pursuit of truth.
Yeah.
So whether you're right or wrong, it's still useful, right? And I agree, right? I mean, I agree from the Islamic basis, but it's like, great, John Stuart Mill, you just understood, the Islamic perspective on this all these centuries later. But where we draw the line is gratuitous insult, because what's the purpose of insult? How does that help truth? I have made this challenge to so many liberals in my debates and so on, and they've never been able to answer it. And they say, "Oh, but offense is subjective." It's like, I didn't mention offense. I didn't say offense. By the way, in English law, you can be prosecuted for causing offense of a sexual nature, for sexual harassment, even if you didn't intend to. All right. So the word offense is mentioned there, and even if it's not even your intention, which is I think unjust. But anyway, English law looks at offense and taking offense. But Sharia looks at intent of the person. Did they intend to commit insult?
Frankly, like for example, we have the Public Order
Public Order Act in
right?
the UK.
2005. I don't know when it was put into place. But I think for example, racism. If you wanted to take this whole freedom of speech thing to the,
that's banned in the UK. In America, Americans might say, "Oh, we disagree with that," and it's not banned in America. But America, they have their own limitations. They have.
But why wouldn't they? I mean, this is the thing. I mean, on liberalism, right? As we've said before, this whole tension between social contract, or you could say the primacy of the individual on the one hand, but on the other hand, you have the supremacy of law, right?
Yes.
So if something is socially contracted, or representatives have the power ceded to them, they're given the legitimacy and mandate to govern, and they, for instance, decide that saying the N-word is something which should not be acceptable. And that wouldn't go against social contract theory. It wouldn't go against liberal theory. You could.
It depends. See, they'd argue that it creates social divisiveness and incohesion, and it incites people to violence. And this is actually the fascinating point. But I don't want to take too much time because this is really fascinating in of itself.
Yes.
John Stuart Mill. He said he was all arguing for free speech, but he made 2 points. One of them was that. During the time there was, due to depression in England, due to the economic system, people were angry at corn dealers, right? So he said that someone should be allowed to say whatever they want and criticize whoever they want, but they're not allowed to, let's say, give a speech, let's say, against like corn dealers outside a corn dealer's house, let's say, when there's an angry mob. Not because the person's going to attack that corn, because you're not allowed to do that anyway, but because violence is most likely going to happen, right? And
he was very to be fair to him, he was quite considerate, and he used a lot of criticality in these points. Because I actually also read something else he talked about and took a note of it as well, which he talks about, for example, someone who committed an offence, a criminal offence, as a result of drinking. And that they should be banned from drinking thereafter if they have committed an offence from it. So this goes back to freedom of expression now. So he's actually putting once again Sharia ban.
Well, what's happening is they say, all right, let's test it. Let's test our theory. So people should be allowed to say what they want. Oh, but when they say what they want, they make each other angry enough to start attacking each other.
So harm comes into it.
This is a problem now. Yep. Okay, we have to start restricting what people say, but where to start? Okay, let's start with things that make people angry. So in America, there's something called a prohibition of fighting words. So if you say to someone, "Oh, your mother is blah blah blah," that could be prosecutable because it's anticipated that would be enough to incite that other person you're speaking to punch you or to start violence.
Is that state-based or federal? Is it federal?
That is federal. Really? Across it. Individual states have even more restrictions against free speech. Things like, for example, disturbing the peace, perhaps. And they even have some very weird laws like against loitering. We're just standing around doing nothing. Shouldn't loiter. And also for moping, which is walking around aimlessly. That's
if that law was enforced, you know, that's a good law.
They don't always enforce people.
I like that law. Well, like, Umar al-Khattab, one time he told some people off for walking slowly, like, he says, move quickly. He had the,
But it's like you can't justify that from, I suppose, liberalism. But there is also the biggest elephant in the room, so to speak, right? Which is so anyway, moving on from the blasphemy law, right?
Yeah.
The blasphemy law, like as the Quran says, if it teaches that basically don't insult the gods of the pagans, lest they insult Allah in their ignorance, right? So if you don't want them to do it to you, don't do it to them.
Right.
It doesn't serve any benefit to insult.
Right.
And I've challenged liberals, atheists.
Economic benefit, social benefit.
No benefit at all. And it doesn't fit the purpose of free speech. And even in this country, if you can't lie against people because they can sue you for libel and defamation.
Yes.
Well, if they have the money now. Also, you can't harass people on the streets. You can't use insulting or threatening behavior. Insulting behavior. Yeah, but even insulting behavior. Right. So just calling someone an idiot or it depends if the policeman really doesn't like you, but they, in theory, could arrest you for it. Mm-hmm. And people have been arrested. Christians in this country have been arrested for street harassment, mainly for saying that homosexuality is a sin in this country. And in the couple, maybe in the 1990s, one Christian was successfully prosecuted and went to jail for that.
Wow.
right? Subsequent to that, they now say, okay, that comes under hate speech laws against homosexuality, right? In America, they might just say, you're just causing disturbance. We might arrest you for that reason. But it's purely at the discretion of the police officer if they're in a good mood or not.
But the point being is that freedom of speech and freedom of expression are necessary extensions of liberal philosophy. They don't just appear, once again, in a vacuum.
I know.
When we assess the first principles of liberalism and the words and kind of quotations of the founders, to see to what extent is freedom of speech, freedom of expression, should it be curtailed, should it be stopped, should it be checked by the ultimate, once again, socially contracted, legitimate, mandated government? We realize that actually it's not what it's made out to be. It's not absolute. It cannot be absolute.
No.
And there are restrictions which, in Mill's own testimony, right, may serve the communal benefit, the societal benefit to uphold.
Well, it's basically it's like they had a theory, they applied it to humans, it didn't work out. Now they're doing patchwork solutions. Okay, now more restrictions, and more restrictions, and more restrictions, to the point that it's actually becoming. I mean, it's actually becoming very. There's not much you can do, it seems, without possibly falling foul of law. There was an American writer who wrote about. He said 5 felonies a day, I believe, is the book title. He said on average, Americans will break 5 laws a day without realizing it.
Wow.
It's just that they're not prosecuting people for it because there's too many people and what have you, right? Because there's so much restriction, so much limitation. But moving on from that, there's more glaring inconsistencies, and what we're discussing now is contradictions within liberalism and contradictions within human nature when it meets liberalism. Right? They realize
practical problems.
Yeah, practical problems. So, for example, they say, okay, drugs were actually allowed under the first version of liberalism, right? When it's first applied, right? So you could smoke hemp or marijuana, basically.
First version, what do you mean?
Oh, sorry. Classical liberalism or libertarianism.
Okay.
Up until the early 20th century, and then we had social liberalism was applied because that model failed, in essence. You could smoke hemp. You could smoke opium, hemp marijuana. Basically, they called it hemp. I think Queen Victoria smoked hemp as well. Actually, yeah, it probably explains a lot. But basically, they realized that it was very addictive. And people became kind of like, a lot of people became useless to do many work. Not everyone that did it, but a lot of people did. And it had bad side effects. And so they started to ban drugs. Now, according to liberal theory, if you're an individual and you can do whatever you want, as long as you're not harming anyone, what's wrong with you consensually taking drugs if it's just yourself? You're just taking it for yourself, right? They can't produce an argument. But socially, it caused so much economic and crime to occur, economic damage and crime to occur, that they had to basically ban it because it just wasn't working. When liberalism meets human nature, you get this problem. There is one remaining drug, which is actually the worst killer of them all, causing the most violence.
Alcohol.
Yeah, you got it. Alcohol and health damage, kills more people in health complications. And directly liver damage and so on than any other drug, and it's alcohol, and they can't ban it because it's culture.
Well, they tried to at one time, the abolition, didn't they?
In the States, not
Right.
in the UK,
Yeah.
not in the UK, but in the States they did. They did try it, and it didn't work out because people wanted it, and they didn't know, and they just thought, okay, we'll relent to public pressure to ease the people,
Wow.
and that's it. So, and alcohol causes so much problems, not beyond that. Because they try to introduce the idea of consent, and you know how it is. Okay, so you can do whatever you want as long as any individual consents to what you do. If you want to do something to them, they have to consent to it, generally speaking. Okay. Otherwise, it's called a violation.
Unless you have a problem with euthanasia. Can you kill someone if they consent? That's one of the issues.
There's a debate amongst liberals about this.
That, yeah.
John Locke was against it. I won't go into detail. I tend to segue into details. But
one thing I find interesting is that where the democratic principle, majority principle, contradicts the liberal and individualistic principle.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one example. And I was thinking about this the other day, actually. I don't know why I was thinking about this. But say, for example, you have 10 people on a ship, and one person has to be thrown off. or eaten or something. And, you have to kill one person.
I think that was Imam Ghazali's argument against utilitarianism.
He talked about in Mustafa.
Yeah.
I was thinking about for that reason, but then this whole consequentialist thing came into my mind, and I started thinking about liberalism. But the point is, I started thinking, right, so if you've got 10 people on the boat or on a ship, and one person needs to be thrown off, otherwise the ship will sink. Say, for example, yeah. What principle would prevail? Would we have the individualistic principle, or would we have the democratic principle? In other words, should we have a lottery that dictates who of those 10 people will live? So we put all the names in a hat, for example, pick one, and that's it. That person goes, throw them off, yeah? Or should we have a vote, and the majority principle decides who should go? So here there's in this case here, you've got a direct contradiction between democratic majority principle and the individual principle. And even in the case where you have a lottery and you put all the names in the hat, does a person have the right to self-consent to death? So all of these things, I mean, you cannot get an answer here. You're going to have to choose one over the other. You're going to have to choose either democracy over liberalism, or liberalism over democracy, or the majority principle over the individualism, or individualism over democracy. Yeah. And that's why this idea of liberal democracy it's not a given. It's not a given that you're going to have everything that's liberal goes in line with everything that's democratic.
Yeah, you don't even need democracy. You don't even need it.
There's going to be trade-offs.
Yeah.
And so I thought from this perspective, I mean, if you don't have a coherent system on how to deal with such a situation, then you simply don't have a coherent system. And that's why you're right to mention Al-Ghazali, because I was reading Mustafa. He was talking about, he had some really interesting principles. It has to be kulli and qat'i, and it has to be kulli and qat'i, and one more thing he said, it's
all an absolute.
All absolute.
Yeah.
And one more thing he said. So it has to concern the whole Muslim community, yeah? So you wouldn't be able to throw that person off in any case. All of them have to die on the ship, basically. You can't take that guy's life in any case.
Well, that's when unless
the whole Muslim community was represented on that ship. So there are certain things, there are certain times and places where murder or the taking of someone's life can be acceptable and not acceptable. And that's all fleshed out very meticulously by our scholars using a kind of what I call Sharia consequentialism. I'm going to have something on that soon. I'm going to write. It's not consequentialism in the utilitarian sense at all. Yani. It's kind of like using the usuli principles. But having said that, I think that these contradictions cannot be ignored. And the idea that they've got it all right and we haven't got it, we have to be liberalized now. In the words of one of the people that I might be debating, called John Chavez, he wrote that you have to liberalize the Muslims. Why should we be liberalized into a system which is itself inconsistent, incoherent, and brings about more problems?
Why does it require coercion of belief and coercing us? Because at least with the Ahl al-Dhimma, see, the great thing about it is, in the West they worry because they say a one-size-fits-all system. So if there's a minority that's not fitting in with what we want them to believe, they could be a potential future threat if they grow. Whereas in Islam, the basis of the dawla, of the state, is the Muslim ummah. Whereas the minorities are considered to be like separate mini-states in a way. Like the Armenians, for example, Armenian Christians even had their own self-police force, right? Muslims didn't go there, didn't bother, didn't have a jurisdiction against them, over them. So what it is that it doesn't matter how many Christians, how big the Christian community grows, or the Jewish community grows, or in the Zoroastrian community grows, or according to other schools of thought, non-Abrahamic minorities grow. They'll never threaten the state because the state is guaranteed by the Muslim Ummah, which has its own structure, whereas non-Muslims have a separate structure, connection with the state, which is one of Ahl al-Dhimma. Whereas for Muslims, the pillar of the state is the Ummah, as the Jama'ah. So right? So we don't have to worry about minorities being fifth columns or what have you, because no, look, you have your autonomy. You can grow as much as you want. It won't affect who is guarding the borders and who's responsible for for maintaining law and order and so on. Which is why Ahl al-Dhimma, you can have true plurality. Their culture, their own law courts, their own values amongst themselves. They can say whatever they want amongst themselves. They can even non-Islamic things which we consider to be blasphemous, if they're just professing their belief, they're allowed to. Whereas in the West, you don't get that multiculturalism. You get suspicion over minorities. You get bans of niqab and hijab as political symbols. You get bans of minarets. You get all this interference in the Muslim community. It's like, why not just let us live as we want and you do what you want? No. You have to live this way.
In effect, what you're saying is that in Islamic governance, you'd have more freedom for minorities. This is your theoretical claim. We're not saying it's a practical claim.
It actually existed in the past, though. That's the thing. It actually existed.
Yeah. So you're saying that you should be able to have, and you did have in times in history, like maybe for example, Andalusia. Yeah.
Or even like India, whether you consider this is right or wrong, Muslims didn't step in and ban sati, which was a Hindu tradition of killing a widow. So when a woman's husband dies, she's meant to enter the funeral pyre, which is obviously burning, and die along with the husband, right? Now, whether you think that's a right or wrong thing is a different discussion. But Muslims, following the principle
I would say they should have stopped it, man.
Well, I mean,
the British Empire stopped it.
The British Empire stopped it, but here's the thing: is it just shows the level of non-interference that Muslims showed.
That's
and plus, if that might have converted so many Hindus to Islam, when they think Muslims don't do this, why are we doing it? You know what? I'm going to actually become Muslim. That's how I'm going to leave this way of doing things.
I remember the third thing. He says, "Kulli, it's got to be in the interest of the whole Muslim community. Qat'i, definite. Yeah. And the third thing he said was daruri. It's got to be a situation need.
Necessity. Yeah,
it's necessity. But okay, so maybe last question, and maybe do it in a nutshell, because I know we have both.
Yeah.
All right. So how is Islam the solution?
Okay, so Islam is the solution on many things. I already discussed how it solves economics, how it solves minorities. I'd even say how it solves problems of racism and fascism, because many racism arises from nationalism, right? All the individuals are meant to collect under a one will, one national will, which is what liberalism envisions, right? So everyone bands together, gives their bear to the government, and then they become one will. The thing is this, though, the will of who? Because if the nation represents the culture of the people and the language and what have you, but there's more than one culture, which is how you define nation. A nation is by language or different culture. Then whose nation is it? That gets to decide the national will. And that's where you have ethnic conflict happen. Who's in, and even in countries which have become secularized in the Muslim world, we see this, right? Not just, so any country where there's multiple nations, we see conflict. Whether it's just on a simmering without violence, like in Canada between the French speakers and the English speakers, or between the French and the Dutch speakers in Belgium, and tensions in England between Welsh and Scottish and even Cornish in some cases. There was like a report of a small terror group in Cornwall, which was like, what? That surprised me. And low-level stuff to really big ethnic conflicts, like in Rwanda and in Kenya, and we see also in kind of secularized Turkey conflicts between Turks and Kurds, whereas before they would be, brothers. They wouldn't look at each other as distinct and different like that way, as well as in between Persians and Arabs and all this stuff. This came about with the nation state idea, and that came about from the liberal understanding of a single will representing the community. So the community of who and what, right? Because you have to pick a language, at least a primary language for the state. Right. Who determines that? And of course, people say, well, my community should have more privilege to decide politics than your community, because my community are the indigenous population. So, we're English, even though they only came about like 1,000 years ago. They're actually invaders, the Anglo-Saxons, but the Welsh are technically the indigenous. But anyway.
You had Vikings coming as well, didn't you?
Yeah, Scandinavians and stuff. So Islam gets rid of that by saying, no, there's no nation states. The state is not based on any nation, any ethnic group. I mean, Muslims might not be perfect in this, and might not sometimes have a bit of a track record of going against it, but it's always been in contradistinction to Islam, not being allowed by Islam. So there's no nation state. There is the Caliph, and his job is being responsible to all Muslims. I don't think Salahuddin cared about being Kurdish when he fought for the Ummah in its entirety.
True.
Right? He didn't care.
True.
Right? And the thing is, subhanAllah, people didn't even care under which regime they were under, whether it was Seljuk Turks or it was Mamluks, which were also Turkic as well, Ottomans. Generally speaking, until nationalism and secular thinking came into the Muslim world, and then they started caring about the ethnic group of people who are ruling them or whatever. And the Ottoman caliphs were of like multiple ethnic groups because their mothers and were from different backgrounds, Romanian or Bulgarian or Arab or what have you, right? So no one really cared at that time. You know, that's where if you do a DNA test, we're all intermixed up, right?
I've done a DNA test.
Oh, really? Okay,
Yeah.
so
I'll tell you the results off here.
Okay, yeah, I'll tell you mine as well, actually.
Well, Abdullah Andalusi, Jazakumullah khairan, and I think we're going to have to wrap up with there. Make sure, guys, that you like, that you comment, and that you subscribe to this channel, inshallah. Also, we probably want you back to talk about feminism. If that's something we could
Hot
prepare.
topic, yep.
Right.
Hot potato.
Yes. But Jazakumullah khairan.
Barakallahu feek.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.